Hello and thanks for watching this video. I'm Dario Mazzola, an Executive Scientific Coordinator of the project PROTECT, an Horizon 2020 project which investigates, as you probably know since you're here, the prospects of the right to asylum, especially in the light of the global compacts. Today, I'm delighted to talk about seizing the compacts, the clash of political and normative discourses over the global compacts on migration and refuge. My perspective is that of political theory, and I will analyze especially the normative and political aspects of the clash of discourses over the compacts. As scholars of refugee studies, probably the paradigmatic document we usually have in mind is the Geneva Convention, signed in 1951. This document is relatively precise in the definitions it offers. While the question of who is a refugee has become classic in refugee theory, at least since an homonymous article by Andrew E. Shaknov, which came out in 1985, the Convention provides a quite remarkably narrow and precise legal definition of who is a refugee. Furthermore, there is a point on which the Convention is even more precise, the description of the obligation of non-refoulement. Finally, the Convention contributed to the shaping of the relationship between its implementing agency, that is, the UNHCR, and the states, a relationship that became increasingly institutionalized in the following decades. And the Convention even contained, by the time, a geographic and chronological limitation, which was then bypassed in the following years and decades. Now, let's compare the Convention with the two global compacts we are discussing today, the one on migration and the other over refugees, especially by taking these two together. If we consider them together, first of all, we are struck by their name, their title. And this happens because the term compact is already more problematic than convention. Its usage is not standard in international legal documents, and Goldenziel, in his 2017 article, claimed that they represent, I quote, a new form of international agreement. They are not international law in themselves. However, they are negotiated by states and will be adopted by the General Assembly as something more than a mere declaration. And this is the end of the quote. The result, it is my conclusion, that the result is paradoxical and double-edged, and now we will see how. As Ferris and Donato notice in their monograph over the compacts, published in 2019, I quote again, the ambiguity around the term compact, in essence a legal sounding term, but indicating a non-binding framework, supports advocates who want to see stronger protection of migrants and refugees' rights, and also provides space for governments to distance themselves from the objectives and the spirit of the two agreements. And this is the end of the quote from Ferris and Donato. As it is evident then, the two readings of the compacts, which can be applied by advocates and the states, are divergent, as I said previously, double-edged, if not, and practically sometimes contradictory altogether. So, this is not the only indeterminacy one encounters when approaching the compacts. These are potentially quite many, as this image is supposed to convey. For instance, the Migration Compact concerns the rights of international migrants, a category including approximately 300 million people, but notoriously difficult to define. And let's say, the division of labor with relation to the Refugee Compact is made unclear by the lack of cross-referencing between the two documents. And to add to this, The Migration Compact includes a disparate set of items, which has been compared with a laundry list by Alenikoff and Martin, and this analogy has also been taken up by Vincent Setai in his criticism of the compacts. Yet the main interrogative points regarding both compacts, this was addressed especially to the migration one, as I said, but the main interrogative points regarding the two documents concern their normative force. It has already been said that the two documents are not, properly speaking, international law. They also proclaim themselves as non-binding, and here we encounter another paradox. That is, the fact that the countries which criticized or even refused to subscribe to one compact are also those who emphasize their relevance the most. After all, if you reject something, perhaps forcefully, as some of these countries did, you are stressing its relevance. Otherwise, why bothering rejecting it, criticizing it, refusing to sign it? And countries who abstained, on the other hand, or subscribed only to ignore the commitments contained in the document, might have chosen the most ergonomic, the most energy effective path toward making the compacts irrelevant, which was their objective. Espinosa et al., in an article published in 2018, list 4 different reasons why some countries, 5 countries to be more precise, might have voted against and 12 abstained. I'm speaking of the Migration Compact. The first reason is symbolic. It's an opposition to migration, most blatantly in the case of Hungary, as Espinosa and Dali explain. The second reason could be fear that the compacts might originate binding practice over time, or even law. The third reason is the reference to human rights as a barrier to sovereignty. We know that there are countries in the world contesting the whole terminology and the framework of human rights. We know it at least since the debate over so-called Asian rights in the last decades. And then, as a fourth reason, we have hostility to the compact, which is not explained by itself, but is a signal toward an external phenomenon such as the growing influence of far-right movements, and this can influence even movements which are and parties which are not far-right, of course, but who are trying to retain power and resist pressure from such parties and movements from the far right. So, while the countries rejecting the Migration Compact are only 3 Visegrad countries, Trump's US and Israel, a quick look at the 12 countries who abstained rather than rejecting suggests that this list of motivation could be non-exhaustive. It is perhaps incomplete. A further group of 24 non-voting countries makes the Migration Compact significantly more controversial than the refugee one, as this latter, the Refugee Compact, was voted against only by the US and Hungary, and there were 3 abstentions and 7 countries which did not vote. They were not present. They didn't send their delegates to the vote. So the views of the scholars over the compacts are, I would say, almost as diverse as those of the states which drafted them and voted them or against them or abstained on them. In a previous paper on the Refugee Compact and political theory, I have in fact sketched the following Cartesian coordinate system, which is meant to map a few of the critics of the compact between irrelevance and impact on the one dimension, as you see, and between regressive and progressive change on the other. So if you see the bottom to top, and it's the irrelevance dimension, and the left to right is the regressive to progressive one. Having said the preceding about academics and states, how can we map more generally the views of the conflict groups distributed around the global cleavages that we consider in PROTECT? This is, as I said in the beginning, and as it should be clear from the title, it's the main goal of my presentation and paper. With all the qualifications which are required when we apply these very broad, non-exhaustive, and highly porous and intersecting categories, we can still sketch an assessment of these four groups one by one. Let's begin with this, with the globalists, in this case represented by the United Nations, but we know it's a very diverse group. So one of the most relevant and powerful groups might be this, the globalists. Still, we see in the present international scenario that they might even happen to be seen by someone as a sort of endangered species, and the reasons for this are manifold. On the one hand, the pandemic has reversed some of the trends of globalization towards greater integration, greater collaboration, greater multilateralism. Really, this was already in crisis before the pandemic, but there are elements of the current crisis which are contributing to this regression, if we want. Therefore, the category of the globalists seems weakened. On the other hand, the pandemic has also exacerbated underlying international tensions, which were also already present, between significant prevailing blocs in world politics, so that no one can claim uncontested hegemony. So, whose globalism has become a very tricky question to answer. Until a few years ago, the globalists could have corresponded, broadly speaking, with those which were ironically called Western globalists by Hadley Bull and more recently by Dario Mazzola, who also relied on Bull's realist theory of international relations. Globalists usually rely on views based on universal human rights, and it might be expected that the globalists would give a strong interpretation of the compacts, an interpretation that claims in favor of greater coordination, in favor of the strengthening of international agencies, and for centralized checks and controls and systems of application, of enforcement of the compacts. Yet, in a world so sharply divided between the US, China, and rather runner-ups such as Russia, the enforcement of a shared international system of norms, even in the limited field of migration and refuge, is unlikely, is more difficult at least. Any country, indeed, finding itself at odds with a particular injunction, say about a more welcoming refugee politics, can leverage between these opposing geopolitical blocs, since there is no one single center. And this might be the case of Hungary, if we want to pick up the example made by Espinosa and Dali. How about the EU? Depending on the context, regionalists are probably very much constrained and limited in their possibilities also, as even the most developed and institutionalized regional actor, whom I will claim the EU represent, struggles, as we see, to elaborate a distinctive policy over migration. By the time I'm recording this presentation, the new EU proposal is still far from completion. How about the nationalists? This is the strongest group, I would say, one that coincides with the most effective and established political unit, that is, the sovereign nation state. Yet, what any particular nation state might be willing to, or even interested in deciding, is in theory and in principle an open question. States are not necessarily more adverse to migration than regions. And still, if we observe the political reality of the day, especially in the wake of COVID, the trend seems to be toward increasing and increased restrictions. How about the final group, the nativists? If Elisabeth Ivars-Flaten, who's also a colleague from the University of Bergen, as myself, but also other theorists of populism such as Cas Mudde, Nadia Urbinati, Hans-Peter Krisi, and many others, if all these theorists are right, the group of the nativists is strictly associated with populism and can gain momentum by mobilizing the discontents of globalization. Given the present dramatic economic and social crisis, this group, I would believe, is likely to retain its influence, at least for the next future. And this can happen both directly by dictating restrictive migration and refugee policies in the countries where populist parties are relatively successful, they share in power, or indirectly by conditioning other political parties and movements who are afraid that their contestation and competition, the one by populist and far-right parties, could cost in electoral terms. So, and I conclude, globalists and regionalists both would have some motivation, as I showed, to put the compacts to use, even in ways which are at odds between them. For instance, the European Union seems to intend the deal with Turkey, which is being renewed in these very days, as the application of the Global Refugee Compact, which is, of course, a reading open to criticism and debate. But on the other hand, nationalists and nativists, in the pursuit of their agenda, might not even need to seize the compact, for instance, by stressing the points about border and migration control. For them, it might be more than sufficient to let the compacts drop. And with this, I conclude. Thank you very much for your attention.